You found us through fly fishing. You'll stay for our passion and the community. Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing podcast.
Yeah, but he doesn't get it. How come fly fishermen don't get it?
You only haul with the short power snap.
Look for where people walk and the insides of bends and hunt those.
The roof blew off and the interior walls got sucked out. And the trees are just coming up. And I mean, he's clearly not going to clear the trees.
It is not a fly fishing story. It's a story about me trying to understand my brother through fly fishing.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today.
We've been waiting for you. Follow our guests, follow us on Instagram, and share this episode and the love if you enjoy this podcast. And we are live in 3, 2, 1. How you doing, Jake?
I'm doing well, man. How about yourself?
Not too bad. Not too bad. Good to chat with you here. Today we're going to talk smallmouth bass. You're in, a part of the country that's popular, I think, for a lot of species. Smallmouth seems to be one of the things it's known for, but you've got steelhead and a bunch of other fish up there. Before we jump into that, let's take it into fly fishing really quick before we talk about Relentless, how you got into this business. How did you first get into fly fishing? What was your first memory?
I would say my first memory was probably, fishing bluegills in a little bass pond. My dad had a old South Bend fiberglass rod that I would take out every now and then, but really wasn't, I was just a fisherman in general. Fly fishing was kind of something was more of like an option when I was younger, and then probably wasn't honestly until senior year of high school / freshman year of college where I really kind of got more into it, and then was offered a job as a deckhand and a fly fishing guide in Alaska, and that's kind of how I started into the career side of it. And I would say that in the grand scheme of experience, I didn't have that much fly fishing experience, but my dad is a commercial fisherman, so I had a lot of fishing experience. And I think that's how I actually got the job, was more my general fishing experience than my fly fishing. And then just kind of took that and ran with it once I realized how much fly fishing was, just kind of spoke to me in a lot of ways. I mean, I never thought I'd be a professional, quote unquote professional fisherman in the conventional world or the commercial world. But when I put a fly rod in my hand and started guiding clients, on a professional level, I realized really quickly that this was something that I could definitely, kind of get into, and I just loved it. So that's kind of how it all started on that level. Was, the people that you deal with in the fly fishing world are just a different breed than the sport world, and I just kind of vibed with them way better. So
right on, nice. And where did you grow up? Where were those first the first fishing you were doing? What state were you in?
Maryland. So I grew up on the in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay on Kent Island, and my first fish on a fly was a bluegill, and I think my second fish was a striper. So a lot of people don't really see me. Well, I should say they don't really, not that they see me, but, I've been getting a lot of publicity over bass, but stripers and saltwater has kind of always been one of my favorite things to target with a fly rod.
Yeah. So, it sounds like, smallmouth bass, I think that was some of our listeners have reached out to me and said to get you on the show. I think it was for smallmouth, but talk about that. Why do you think you're known so much for smallmouth now and not some of the other species? Is it mainly the book you have out there now, or what is that?
I think the book definitely helped that for sure. But, in all honesty, the last 12 years, 14 years, all I've really talked about is smallmouth bass, and that's kind of been my passion. And so, most people hire me to guide them for bass now. I think, probably 5 or 6 years ago, it was, still 50-50 trout versus bass. And within those 5 years, it went to, 95 bass, 5% trout. So
wow.
I hardly guide for trout anymore. And if I do, it's, kind of more of the beginners and, 1 or 2 anglers type of thing. But, I think it's really just because I talk about it so much and I love it. And, I've designed a few bass flies that are, out there. And so I think, just over the years, it's been, kind of cultivated into my, image or, knowledge base or whatever you want to call it. So
Right. That's awesome. And what do you think it is about smallmouth for you? You know, the difference between smallmouth and trout. What's the big difference between the two? Or are there a lot more similarities?
There's a lot of similarities for sure. Actually, I wrote an article for Fly Fisherman magazine last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago, and it was literally trout tactics for smallmouth. That was the entire article. So, it was all about, low water smallmouth and how those bass become very, very like similar to spring creek trout. And a lot of people don't think about that. They're like, oh, they're just a bass. And I'm like, well, yeah, but they're a big water predator that also gets a lot of pressure. So, whether it's a bass or not, it still can become very, weary of its surroundings and picky on what it eats. So,
Yeah, that's it. Wow, that's cool. So so they can become kind of, I guess, trouty. Is that the word when they get to it, where they're eating bugs and things like that? What do they? I mean, are they taking some dry flies, some stuff that's really small, bugs that are hatching off, things like that?
oh yeah, I mean, you see them, surface wise, you can see them eating something as big as a frog, or all the way down to a size, 24 trico, which is
Right. Wow.
quite obnoxious, because the last thing I'm going to have is a trico in my box. But I will say that even though they pick up and eat that stuff, if I were to throw a small black popper or something over them, they would probably still eat it. Although the other day we were fishing and there were some fish in the kind of mid-teens range, rising to what looked like kind of a summer sulfur, or something along that yellowish size 16 range. Fish don't know the Latin name, so I don't know the Latin name. I just know the size and the color.
I hear you.
But so we put a yellow popper over them. They didn't eat it. We put a couple different foam bugs. They didn't eat it. And then I put on a tan, honestly, like Catskill style, dry fly, and they started smashing it. So they were being pretty particular on that specific day, which was kind of fun to figure out. So, extremely trouty on that sense.
Right on. And just for people listening, describe where you are now, where you guide, where your operation is.
Yeah, so I am South Central Pennsylvania, mainly guiding the Juniata and the Susquehanna. I don't personally do a lot on the Susquehanna, just because I like the Juniata better, and but we do some of the tributary stuff in the springtime. So our bass season is pretty much from late March all the way until middle to end of October. So we've got a pretty long season, and then we just change location due to conditions and flows and stuff like that. So I would say our base of operation is within an hour and a half circumference of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So
Gotcha. Yep. And right now we're kind of we're coming up to September. And then October's right around the corner. So, and then what happens towards the end of the season? Is it just a temperature thing, or what's going on when things stop or why do you stop in October?
Mainly because the water temps drop pretty significantly, and these fish become very, at least on a fly, they become very difficult to sometimes catch and find. So when the water starts to drop, those fish will kind of leave their what we call like summer haunts. Like in the summertime, you can just fish the banks or, long stretches of the middle of the river, and those fish are kind of spread out. And, you're not going to catch one every cast, but they're in an area where when you're just continuously casting, you're going to bump into fish throughout the day. As we get into this fall period, these fish start to school up and migrate to deeper water. And so like there's a significant lull between fish, but with that lull normally comes like, a spurt of activity or a flurry of activity, because those fish start to school up and they're going to be kind of together. So where you might go an hour without a fish, when you find one, there's a good chance you're going to find multiples. But the other reason why we kind of stop is because steelhead season's right around the corner. And I would personally probably try to bass fish a lot more into November, but it takes a very special angler to go out there and just like, get punched in the face all day for a few fish. So,
Right. Gotcha. That's it. So yeah, the steelhead, and that's something do you still guide for steelhead out there?
I do. Yeah. I guide in Erie. And so I've got two guys that guide in Erie with me. And then I've got one guy that does the Salmon River up in New York. So,
oh yeah,
we kind of transition towards end of October into the Great Lakes region. I'm licensed in New York and Pennsylvania. as well as one of my other guides, and my third guide's about to get his New York license. So between the three of us, we kind of move from, Pulaski all the way down to Erie, PA. So we're not on one specific system, which is kind of fun. But yeah, so, the bass thing, it just kind of more opportunities, and the fishing definitely slows up. And you talk to certain guys that are gear fishermen, and they're like, oh, the fall, like October, November, December is awesome. I'm like, yeah, if you've got a tube jig and 6-pound tippet or 6-pound line that you can, just sit on the bottom, and you got a jet boat that you can just run to the holes they're in, where, drift boat fishing can be a little bit monotonous once you get into that later season.
Today's episode is brought to you by Northern Rockies Adventures, premium fly fishing trips in the heart of the BC Rockies. Premium all-inclusive fishing packages from Vancouver, BC. Daily fly-in fishing trips to get you straight to the action, and the lodges offer private cabins and the utmost comfort. Learn more about this exclusive BC fishing trip at nradventures.com/wetflyswing. You guys are floating it for the most part in drift boats for bass?
Yeah. So springtime we run rafts most of the time in kind of the smaller water, and then June, July, August, September time frame we're running drift boats. I do have one guide that does some walk weight stuff for bass, and he's it's become very popular in the summertime. He's was mainly a trout guide and a steelhead guide, and when he started working for me full time, he's like, what should I do in the summertime? And I was like, well, you can buy a drift boat, or you can, just take people walk wading, because, he grew up in Perry County. He's knows every inch of all of the water in that area. And I'm like, just start doing that. And he's become very popular. And so he stays pretty busy in the summer, fishing smaller water. And oftentimes it's, you're not going to catch 20-inch bass every time you go, but you do have a chance at a couple big fish, and it's a lot of sight fishing on foot. And so again, talking about bass being very similar to trout, I mean, when you're wade fishing low clear water for bass, they become even more trouty, and your presentation has to be more trouty. And so, it can be technical at times, and he really loves that stuff. So
yeah. Wow. That's awesome. I love that. And the walk and wade, stalking the fish. So let's talk about maybe how you would do a typical trip. Let's say we were coming up there and, in September to fish with you. Take us through a day. How does that look? Talk about how you catch bass there in your area.
Yeah. So, we typically, there's a small diner that we meet at, and a lot of people will beat me there and have breakfast, because the food's, kind of small town.
Oh, nice. And what's that diner? What's the name of that diner so we don't miss it?
It's Thompsontown Corner Deli is the name of the diner. But so they've got ice cream in the summertime. They've got breakfast, lunch, and dinner. No alcohol. It's just, sweet tea, water, and soda. But their food's pretty good. And if you're taller than about 6'3", you got to be careful when you go to the bathroom. You might hit your head on the back of the building.
All right.
But so we meet there, and we go shuttle the boat in the morning. We had a shuttle, but currently post-COVID, we don't have a shuttle. So we use the client to help with that, and then dump the boat in, and hopefully in the first 10 minutes, we catch a bass on some form of popper or crayfish in the summer. And then we kind of meander through the day. And, we have different styles, depending on what we're fishing. If I know we're going to do a lot of cray fishing, I will pick a shorter float, like about 4 miles, and kind of do what I call hole hopping or, spot jumping, and just kind of fish our way through. But every time we get to a good spot where we can stop and anchor and actually present crayfish, for a half hour to an hour, and hopefully catch a bunch of fish, we'll kind of do that. And then, but if I know it's going to be more of a popper day or, a streamer day, bait fish, we'll pick like an 8-mile float and kind of just stick and move all day and fish and move around and whatnot. So the rivers, the Susquehanna itself is pretty big. So, you can spend a lot of time just going back and forth side to side, because there are sections of it that are close to a mile wide. But, the Juniata, I'd say on the widest is maybe a 1/4 mile, maybe a little bit less than that. And so, we can bounce around side to side and, mid-river and stuff like that. So, and then about halfway through the day, I would have already asked you the night before or a few days before what you particularly wanted for lunch. And I hand you a nice box lunch with some snacks and a sandwich, and we do that. And then we fish until we get tired.
That's it. And the lunch options are a nice, I'm guessing, a good sandwich with, what's that look like? I'm just want to paint the picture because lunch is always a good one.
Yeah. So typically, one of the things I'm going to say, sorry, Paul, my old boss in Alaska. One of the things I brought away from Alaska was how much a lunch can make or break your day. And I will say my old boss wasn't the greatest at the lunch deal. So when I started doing it, I went through different phases. I used to bring a grill and, make burgers, but I'm like, it's 100 degrees in July. Who wants to be standing around a grill? So now we do I send you a menu, and you get a choice between ham, turkey, roast beef, roll or wrap. And typically that wrap is going to be, a spinach wrap or, one of those more fancy ones. And then the buns are either a pretzel bun or an onion bun. And I do the ham and meat and cheese on the sandwich. And then in a separate bag, we do lettuce and tomato and sometimes onion just so it doesn't get soggy. So it's kind of a deconstructed sandwich. And then you get apple or orange, chips or popcorn, Nature Valley or Kind Bar, and then we do some brownies or some cookies. So it's a pretty deal.
And maybe some coffee or some drinks on the side.
Yeah, and then we'll do I'll have water, Gatorade, and I don't provide alcohol, but my boat is not an alcohol-free boat, so I've got some guys that bring like a Manhattan in a flask or a couple beers, and we'll pull over and have a drink at lunch as well. But
that's it. Yeah, it seems like most people, from my experience in these guide trips, as we've been getting into them, that most people, even if they like drinking, it's never a priority because, right, the priority is to be on the water, and you don't want to ruin your day. So I always feel like alcohol is never an issue. Is that kind of how it looks for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that most guys, even some of my good clients that I know can stay up till 4 a.m. and party, they're like, nope, when we're on a boat, we're here to fish. And even us guides, like you go through phases. Sometimes you're like, I'm gonna bring a few and maybe just periodically drink, but but at the end of the day, there's still all of the beer in the cooler and you're out there fishing. So fishing is definitely the main priority on that sense.
I heard something, I can't remember who it was. We were talking to somebody talking about the guides, but I think he wrote something about the guides, whatever you call it, this dilemma that some guides get into where they start to, it's almost like the party atmosphere, right? They start getting into this, and maybe it's not in your neck of the woods, but some of these areas where it's this guide atmosphere, there's lots of drinking, smoking, all sorts of stuff. And you see people sometimes go off the deep end. Is that something that you've ever seen out there and kind of with the guides? Is that something you ever had to deal with?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that I've had a couple clients that have probably, drank a little too much, and, the guides, I think most of the guides are pretty good on that sense. I mean, post guiding, I've definitely seen some guys show up, the next morning with a bottle of Pedialyte or something. And
right.
I just look at them and it's like, really? I feel like you probably should have done that. And they're like, oh, it'll be fine. But I've never seen any, at least of my guides, get to the point where they were like, I can't guide because I'm hungover or something like that, or hinder their day because of it. So, I mean, in all honesty, we've all done it. I mean, I could tell you a very embarrassing story about me falling out of my own boat when I was a younger guy.
We'll save that one for the end. The end.
I personally have a rule that I don't drink the night before a guide trip anymore. And unless it's a good client that I've fished, a lot of days, I won't even share an alcohol beverage with them. So, but no, I mean, most of us are pretty good about it out here anyway.
Yeah, it's great. Well, and just so people know, I'm sure everybody's aware of it. I've actually been getting into some of these like non-alcoholic beers, just to mix things up. And man, there's some really good, like high quality stuff. See, I'm not sure if that's changed over the years, but so for those that want to, that still love the taste but don't want the alcohol, there are some good options out there.
Oh yeah, there's there's one called Athletic, I think.
Exactly, Athletic. Yep.
Yeah, that one's pretty good. I remember I had a client bring me one. He's like, "Here, try one of these. It's a non-alcoholic IPA," and I was like, "There's no alcohol in this."
I know.
It tastes just like a real one.
I'm gonna give a shout out just because I've got this. This is a really good one for those listening. Is what is it called? I think it's called Migration Ale. They got a citrus hazy IPA, and that's really awesome as well. I'm not sure where they're out of, but yeah, there's a bunch. So and they're not a sponsor of this podcast, but I think this is good stuff. So we got the good. We've taken care of the beer conversation here. I want to go back. You mentioned crayfish. So when you're coming up for the day, are you asking your clients, what do you kind of want to focus on, or is it just depending on what's going on? Like when you choose crayfish versus poppers versus streamers?
It's just a matter of, kind of condition, what's going on. I mean, one of the things that's super cool about crayfish is that in our water, they're just so predominant that, they are a main food source pretty much all summer long. And one thing I've learned over the years, and I don't think it's like any secret, but big bass in the springtime are very aggressive because they're kind of coming out of that, wintertime zombie-like stage where they're not eating much and their metabolism's starting to spike, and they're moving into some of these smaller creeks to migrate, and they're just getting very aggressive. And so, springtime is really fun because you can throw, 6, 7, 8-inch flies for bass and move them really fast, and those fish are going to be aggressive. But once you hit that kind of July, August, September timeframe, there is so much food in the water, whether it be crayfish, bugs, minnows, hellgrammites, nymphs, all kinds of stuff. Those fish become very particular on what they're going to eat and how much energy they use to eat that food. And so the one thing that I've found is that summertime, if you throw a bait fish pattern and you're burning it across, the water, you're going to catch some fish, but they're typically going to be smaller. But when you slow your presentation down and you start, crawling a crayfish on the bottom and making that easy for those fish to eat, those bigger fish are pretty easy to they're never easy, but they're easier to entice into eating. And that's the same with the popper. We do a lot of like no popping, just free floating a popper, almost dead drifting a popper. And so slowing those presentations down is what I think creates a bigger interest in those larger fish to eat. And so summertime, typically you've got two options, popper or crayfish. And that's kind of how I run my program. And, not necessarily crayfish in general, but like some sort of bottom dwelling food, whether it be a hellgrammite or a stonecat or, a leech or something like that. But, keeping yourself low and slow is where you're going to catch most of your fish. And so typically July through, now is when I'm going to run crayfish or poppers. And those are kind of the two options. But when you start to get into that October range, the crayfish start to, kind of burrow underneath the rocks and in the mud, and they become very less active. The bug life is gone. And all of a sudden the only thing left is minnows. And so, these fish will start to go back on that minnow bite kind of early to mid-October. And so you can start fishing, bigger stuff, or at least bait fish imitations once they start to get more aggressive. So I just think summertime is a crayfish popper type of season. And that's where I start and end my day.
Stonefly Nets is always focused on quality over quantity, and right now you can find out what a high-quality handcrafted net is all about. Ethan runs his shop in the Ozarks and handcrafts some of the sweetest wood landing nets you'll see on the market. I've been using the Stonefly nets for quite some time now, and every time I land a fish, I find myself enjoying the net as much as I enjoy looking at that fish. You can select from 4 sizes and many different options, including choosing the handle, the loop, and the different types of burls that you put in there. For Ethan, fly fishing has always been a great memory that was created on a morning. He was casting that 3-weight bamboo rod that was passed down for generations. And Ethan is right now helping us create these same lasting memories every time we're on the water. Check out these custom classic wood nets right now if you head over to wetflyswing.com/stonefly. That's wetflyswing.com/stonefly, STONEFLY, to get started right now. Okay, back to the show. Let's talk about the crayfish a little bit. Maybe describe kind of the gear you're using, how you're setting up, and how you're fishing for them. Is this all sight fishing, or how does this look?
There is a lot of sight fishing, and honestly, sight fishing crayfish is pretty awesome. It's very flat style bonefish permit, where you're getting a little bit of a lead, but not too far, and you're, just slowly presenting that and watching the fish eat. And whether it's a crayfish or a popper, that visual eat is, in my opinion, there's nothing that really matches that. But crayfishing has evolved for me in the last couple of years a lot. I used to fish sinking lines, heavy sinking lines, medium, large lead eyes to get down there, thinking that, oh, you got to get down and stay down. And I realized that I probably spent more time tying crayfish than I actually did fishing them because I lost them all. So what I've started to do in the past like 2.5 to 3 seasons has been floating lines with slightly longer fluoro leaders and a lighter crayfish. So instead of fishing a medium lead eye, I'm fishing small or extra small lead eyes, and also moving into kind of some of that tungsten stuff. And so I really like fishing like either 118 or 1/8 or whatever, 5/32, whatever's right underneath of that. So smaller tungsten beads, and getting those flies to get on the bottom, but not necessarily get hung up. And so you get way more ability to manage your presentation with a floating line. So just like pre-indicator fishing, you're using the tip of your fly line as your indicator, and having fly line on the surface versus subsurface makes you be able to mend it more or throw a little bit of slack in there, whether you're mending upstream or downstream, to kind of slow that presentation down and almost get a spin fishing, kind of tube jig style presentation. Because I found that it's not so much the fly. I mean, let me back up for a second. I have some guys that fish with me that are spin guys, and they fish a lot of tube jigs and a lot of Ned rigs, and just that kind of bottom bouncing rubber bait. And when the Ned rig came out, all these fly tires were like, "Ooh, I need to tie a Ned fly." And my mentality was, I don't think it's necessarily the bait itself. It's how that bait is presented and how it's staying on the bottom, and you can manipulate how fast or slow that presentation is, and it stays in front of the bass longer. They fall relatively slow because they're rubber and they've got some air pockets in them. So that slower fall is huge because that bass can see that thing coming down to hit the bottom. And so I found my mentality was, well, how do we just fish the flies that we know work really well the same way? And that's where the floating line, longer leader came from for me. And it's something I actually tried probably 5 or 6 winters ago when my buddies were crushing them on tube jigs, and I was out there with a fast sinking line trying to catch a fish, in 35-degree water, and I couldn't do it. So I was like, the next time I went out, I took a 16-foot leader, which was horrendous to cast, and a heavy fly, and realized that was the first time I tried to do it, and it worked. And so now we run slightly thinner leaders, so you don't have as much drag on the section of line that's under the surface. And then you got a longer leader, so it also doesn't pull that floating line down. So you've got to pay attention to the amount of line you have between the fly and the floating line, and so you can kind of keep yourself a lot slower. So it is a very difficult way I think, to kind of fish for those smallmouth. But once you catch a couple that way, the feeling and the visual recognition of what that tip of that fly line does. I've taught a lot of people this year how to do it with great success, and everybody's like, "Oh my gosh, like we didn't lose a single crayfish today." And I was like, "Yeah, pretty awesome."
Right.
So that's my deal. I mean, I love the crayfish game. So
yeah, describe that again. That tip of the fly line, how you use that to your advantage.
So it gives you something to look at, and typically what I do is when I put my mend in, as soon as that fly hits the water, I try to keep a small little, kind of little, I call it a J, or a little belly, anywhere from 6 inches to 2 feet. And that's pointed upstream. And then the rest of your line is kind of pulling it down, so you can still kind of mend it and slow it down, but you keep that little J in there. And anytime that fly line does anything but float freely, whether it starts to, dip down a little bit or, jolt. My favorite is when the tip of the fly line actually starts swimming downstream faster than your fly line,
right?
Because the fish grabs it and starts going down. But I'm just using that as a visual recognition. And bass, when they eat a crayfish, they're not swimming through it. And so it is a very soft eat initially. And so I tell everybody, look, if it does anything, set on it, because it might feel like a rock, it might look like a rock, but that fish is just coming up behind in it and sucking it in or pinning it to the bottom. So there's not a lot of movement until you make the movement.
What's the set look like for those fish when you see that little subtle thing?
It's kind of a hybrid, a hybrid strip set / trout set, where you're kind of stripping and lifting the rod slowly, but it's not a crazy, like, say tarpon set where
Yeah,
you're
right.
giving it all you got. But because a lot of times if it is a rock, so it's kind of more of like well, I kind of call it like a prospecting hook set where like you set it where you get enough pressure to know that it's either a rock or a fish, and then you give it a second set.
Oh, right.
Because a lot of times if it's not a fish, when you set, if it's about to get stuck on a rock, because that fly is so light, it just pops over the rock and then you can continue your drift. Where if you like do a full trout set, strip set, giant, thing, you got to reset and do it all over again. So sometimes you can save your drift.
Gotcha. Save your drift. Cool. And then and that little J thing you're talking about. So if you were kind of looking downstream, river, float the rivers. I guess you're standing on the bank, river right. The river's flowing from left to right. You cast, like if you saw a fish. I guess one opportunity would be you see a fish, you make that cast, and then you put a little upstream mend in it. Is that the J? Is that what you're talking about?
Yep, I'm going to put a little upstream mend in it, but I'm not going to put a huge upstream mend, because if I traditionally do an upstream mend like I was indicator fishing or something where I want to get that whole, fly line and leader above the fly, then it's going to take a lot longer. And for that fish has got to hold on to that fly a lot longer for me to know it's there. Where if I keep that little J in there, it's keeping tension, but you also have a freedom to mend multiple times without, moving the fly too much. The other thing that is really good is if you do micro mends, every time you micro mend, that fly is just going to lift up a little bit and drop back down, lift up and drop back down. And it's going to kind of look like a tumbling.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
Right. So you could be fishing this on a little, there could be a little current there or whatever, and it's kind of fishing down. How's that look? Are you typically casting up, out, down? How are you doing that when you're not necessarily fishing, a pool or something like that?
I always cast slightly upstream just to give yourself a little bit of an angle. And again, it's like a fine line between having, enough tension to feel it and too much tension where you're, dragging it, through the current faster than those fish want to eat it. So I always tend to cast upstream just a little bit. If we're fishing and floating, like if the anchor's up and we're not fishing an actual pool, it's more of a straight across or slightly downstream, and then it's just a very slow kind of constant pull. And when I tell people, well, I should say a lot of people ask me how long of a pull, and if they're right-handed, they normally have the rod hanging off the right side of their body somewhere around pocket length. And so I say about the length till you touch your other pocket. So, 12 to 18 inches, and then just constant, because every time you go to grab more line, that fly pause for a second. And so you don't want to burn it real fast, but it's just kind of a steady, consistent movement. And you can slow that down if you want. And the number one thing, again, is watching the tip of that fly line. If the tip of that fly line starts to get, pulled upstream way more than it isn't, then you might want to speed it up just a little bit. And so, like, again, paying attention to that tip of that line to manage the speed of your retrieve is very important. But with a lighter fly, you have a much wider berth, to not get stuck. So you have a bigger, you have more room for error.
Exactly. More room for error. Exactly. That's it. So you have this fly, and that's what you've learned is, the little bit lighter, going lighter, it gives you more action and decreases the, getting snagged up, which is great. And then talk about the flies a little bit. It sounds like you got a few of your own flies. Describe maybe something you would fish for the, crayfish here and some of the flat patterns you have.
I would say the most recent crayfish that I have is, it's not overly complicated to tie, but one thing that I have noticed and I think is very important is the size of the claws of a crayfish. And so all of my claws are tied with pine squirrel zonker instead of rabbit, because our native crayfish actually have pretty small claws, where our invasives have really big, like the rusty crayfish. The claws are basically the same size as the whole crayfish. So I'm always looking at what's easier for a bass to eat, small claws or big claws. And so small claws are very important. I do add some foam to the back of it. I know guys like, Blaine Chocolate and, some of these other guys that have really, kind of innovated the whole world with the Game Changer platform. Like, he has a lot of foam on the back of his stuff, but he's trying to get that, vertical stand like a Ned rig. And I just add a little bit of foam to keep that hook point up just a little bit. So it's not like I'm trying to keep it vertical. I don't put foam on the claws because the purchase area of a pine squirrel zonker versus a rabbit zonker is significantly smaller, and it just falls off. So I add a little bit to the back of the hook shank, and then I just do a single articulation. So I use my primary, summertime crayfish is a size 4 Ahrex light stinger. So it's not super long. It's not really big. It's actually a lighter wire hook, and I like lighter wire because it bends out a little easier if you do get stuck, and you can bend it back multiple times, which is kind of nice. So I would say I've had them bend out multiple times to get a fly back, and I've bent them 3, 4, 5 times and haven't had one break yet. So, nice. So that lighter wire is nice. It also creates easier penetration into that fish's mouth. And then a single 15 millimeter 60-degree jig shank from Spawn Fly Fishing. Those things are awesome. And I actually really like the Spawn football tungsten beads that he has. I use those a lot. I think they don't get stuck as much because they've got just a little bit different profile. So it kind of creates that width, which is kind of nice. And so, and then I do one thing that I have not seen much of. Personally, I've never seen it, so I'm sure somebody's done it before me. But I take rabbit and I actually cut it off of the zonker strip, off the hide, and reverse tie it over the back of the crayfish. And that gives me kind of that carapace or that shell back, gives me the ability to flare it out, and it just creates a really nice profile. And then one of the most important factors of all crayfish is rubber legs. Smallmouth love rubber legs. So I do 8 on each side. So I have 16 legs on it. So it's almost, but they're not long. I cut them short. They never go past the actual claw length. So, it's not like it's just this giant skirt of rubber. They're strategically placed on there. So that's one of my main crayfish. And then I do use like Blaine's changer crawl a lot, especially in the spring. And but I think smaller is better in the summertime. And then I also have a stone cat or a mad tom or a baby catfish pattern that's tied very similar. Could be sculpin, but I do add whiskers off the front, so it's officially a catfish imitation. And then just a couple different leech patterns. Mike Schultz's red-eyed leech is really good. I do make them also lighter. I have some heavy stuff for the wintertime, but summertime stuff I try not to go any more than a small lead eye. And then a buddy of mine's got this goofy little, again, Spawn has those micro like dragon tails. I forget what he calls them, but he basically ties this little leechy looking thing. It kind of looks like a Hellgrimite or leech, and that works really well too. So I would say on average, my summertime subsurface stuff is no more than 3 inches. I think that's one of the most important parts. So
right. So that's it. So you're using summer, using smaller stuff, and then, like you said, spring you can go big, or later in the season you can go back to some of the bigger stuff. Is that like when you're in October? Could you go to some of those 7-8 inch flies?
You definitely can, and I think that it's all condition oriented. Like right now we had rain for the past 3 days, and so that water's coming up a little bit, and it's creating that kind of cover, which is nice. So even if those fish are eating primarily minnows or bigger bait fish, and when the water's low and clear, you still have an issue with spooking those fish. And so I always tell people it's more important to be able to get your fly in front of the fish to present it to them versus actually matching that exact bug. So yes, right, we all want to throw big stuff, but if the water doesn't give us the ability to throw big stuff, we have to keep throwing small stuff. But one of my favorite flies for the springtime when it's still cold is Russ Maddin's Circus peanut.
Oh yeah,
that fly has caught some of the biggest fish of the season, and I actually have inverted them sometimes where I want the hooks to ride up, basically because I've learned over the past probably 10 years is that typically our hooks become blunt before we lose them because there's so many rocks in our system. So being able to protect those hooks is really important. So I've inverted them, a lot of times to do that. But that fly is just a killer. I mean, you just change the color of it, and it can be just about anything. So, moving into the fall, I'll fish a lot of that stuff as well. So kind of a double hooked, some sort of weighted bug on the subsurface and roll with that. But the bait fish stuff's also awesome. I love fishing articulated minnow patterns and things like that. So
yeah, That's awesome. So, I mean, like you said, I mean, a lot of this stuff works, including flies, like we said at the start. But like you're saying, so what were the patterns? Do you have a couple of name patterns we might look at that are out there, or maybe you've mentioned them already?
For baitfish or for crayfish and stuff?
For either one, yeah, crayfish or whatever you have there.
The one baitfish that I have is called the roamer. That's one of my signature flies. I tie it from a size 2 all the way up to a double hooks with a shank, so a triple, if you will, or a single like 2-aught. That's kind of one of my favorite fall sizes. It's about 5.5 to 6 inches. So super light to cast. Kind of gives you that kind of fluky, gliding side to side motion. And my crayfish and Helgramite patterns, they're not available to purchase yet. But I did just sign a contract with Montana Fly Company. And so
cool.
I'll have about 8 patterns with those guys. But my YouTube channel, which is Relentless TV, does have some of that stuff already on it. A lot of these patterns are also in my recent book that I published, Smallmouth Bass Flies, top to bottom. So, there's at least ways to tie them, or there's literature to tie that stuff. And if I can get my act together, I will be doing a lot more tying videos through the winter time, and hopefully continue those through the season, moving forward. So
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah, we'll put some links to this in the show notes. Your Relentless TV channel and your book as well. We'll have links to that so everybody can take a look and go deeper. And then you mentioned Montana Fly Company. We recently we have an episode that came out and we talked about the history of that company, which is pretty cool. So this is good. So I think we have a good feel. So let's take it back to the river. So you're sitting there, you're targeting that fish. It's sight, you see it. Talk about maybe the water, set this up, and then how you get that fish to take.
I'll do 2 different scenarios. So we'll do a topwater scenario and a subsurface scenario. So one thing that I've argued with so many clients and friends about is that, when you see a fish on a flat and you're fishing a popper or, some sort of terrestrial, a lot of people want to go into that trout mentality of, we got to cast it, 20 feet above it and present it slowly down to it and, twitch it at the right moment. And I've noticed that 100% of the time when you do that, that fish doesn't eat it for whatever reason. I have found that if you put that fly within a foot or 2 of that fish's, face or just general area, as long as it's not, behind them, that plop sound will get their attention. And then you play this kind of cat and mouse game with them where you might twitch it once to get their attention or, might not do anything with it. And I say, you got 50% chance that you're going to spook that fish when you drop it on its head, but you also have a 50% chance that it's going to eat it versus 0% chance if you present it the other way. So I always go with 50% is better than 0. And then you've got to read that fish just like a trout. I mean, there are plenty of times where those fish will come up and they'll stare at it for 10 seconds before they eat it. And so you have to not move it because they're interested in it. And sometimes if you twitch it, that'll spook them. I'd always tell people not to touch that popper or that, terrestrial until that fish loses interest, where it's as soon as that fish's head starts to go back down, twitch it. And it's either going to spin around and grab it or it's going to keep going down. But sometimes I think they look at it to inspect that it's alive and then they eat it. And that's where, the rubber legs of a popper or rubber legs of a terrestrial is nice because it creates motion even when you're not doing anything. So reading that fish's attitude is the most important thing. Sometimes as soon as that thing hits the water, they come up and smash it. Other times it's a long drawn out process that's quite maddening as a guide to watch that fish think about it, but not eat it. And sometimes color is a huge thing. If, you're fishing a bigger popper or a bigger grasshopper or something like that, that's in that tan or, white or yellow color range, those colors and sizes often indicate a bug that's not going to leave the surface very easy. So that fish has plenty of time to inspect it. Where if you start to see a lot of fish looking and not committing, think about some of their other food on the surface that they are a lot faster to, commit to, like a damselfly or a dragonfly, because damselflies and dragonflies never actually touch the water unless they're riding on a piece of grass or something like that. And so when a fish are on damselflies, you switch to something that might be a little smaller and blue, you're going to see a pretty significant difference in commitment rate and speed, because those fish have to commit to eating that fly before it gets close enough for them to inspect it, because they know it won't be there very long. And that's why if you're, middle of summer, you look downstream, you see bass jumping out of the water. They're trying to eat damselflies mid-flight, which is kind of fun. So
God, that's great.
yeah. So as a guide, you kind of look at those things, or even if there's not that many damselflies, but those fish are being very picky and not very committal, throw something smaller in blue or smaller in olive on, and there's a good chance you're going to see a difference in commitment on those fish, which is kind of fun. So, and then backing up to the crayfish or kind of that subsurface bottom dwelling thing, that is one where I do want to get it a little further away because it does have weight on it. So that initial plop sometimes can be too much for those fish, where if you can get it on the bottom, quietly, and then kind of swing it in front of them or pop it right when you get close to them. We had an amazing crayfish day on Friday. We had good clarity, we had good sun, and we were watching fish move like sometimes 6 to 10 feet to eat a crayfish.
Wow.
And I haven't seen that aggression towards a crayfish all summer. So you can definitely tell the water temps are getting cooler and those fish are like getting a little bit more active. But you get it in the water in front of those fish and you kind of create that speed that you need and bounce it, tumble it through the rocks on the bottom. And when you get close enough to those fish, it is also sometimes a cat and mouse game where like, you got to mend it once to pop it and that fish runs over and stares at it. And then you twitch it one more time and, they're looking at it again and you twitch it one more time. They look at it and then you give it like a 3 or 4 inch pull where it looks like it's going to get away. And that's typically when they pounce on it and grab it, when they're like, look, oh boy, it's going away. And then they grab it. So you definitely want to run the crayfish a little further away and make sure it's on the bottom as drag free as possible so that you can manipulate it how you need to. Again, reading that fish's reaction and reading that fish's attitude and kind of play that game of cat and mouse with those fish. So that stuff gets me super excited when I get to see that.
That's awesome. Yeah, the cat and mouse sounds like fun. So you're kind of, you're just keeping it engaged. And then as soon as then you do that longer strip to let them know, hey, I'm out of here, then they attack it.
Yep. Then they oftentimes will jump on pretty quick. So
nice. How do you, as you're going down, are you guys floating? I mean, I know you obviously know the water, but if somebody's new to an area, how would you find the fish? Are they kind of, like you said, I guess during the right season, they're scattered all over the place, but do you find that it's hard to find the fish at any times?
Yeah, I mean, definitely like as we get in, early season. So I shouldn't say early season. I should say kind of early summer. We do some years, this year was a little bit different, have that kind of like post-spawn lull where those fish are kind of moving around, but they're not super, super aggressive yet. And they're not really set up. And so, June is typically when that happens and it can be a hard experience as a guide. Feel like I'm beating my head against a wall, trying to find them. And then in the fall, when those fish start to move and, school up and, get into some of these deeper holes, just finding those holes. I mean, there's always like, that textbook hole where it's deep, it's slow, a lot of rock. Typically there's going to be fish there, but sometimes there isn't. And so finding the place that those fish are. And the other thing that's interesting this time of year is that they're not always there. They move around a lot. And so like you could have a school of fish in one pool on a Monday, and by Wednesday there's 0 fish in there because they sat there for a while and we're like, nah, this isn't where we want to be. And they move somewhere else. And so I would say, June and then October are kind of hard to find fish. But if you're new to the area or you're getting out, you're floating on the river and you've never done it. I mean, the best thing to do is start on the banks, and kind of just see where those fish are once you start finding them, and looking for wood, looking for slow eddies, rocks, deeper pools. I mean, depth is all relative where, you could be in a section of river where it's, a foot deep, but then there's a 2 foot deep hole, on the bank or something where it doesn't look that much deeper, but that's enough for those fish to get over. Because summertime, as much as wood, rock, grass, and overhanging trees are cover, bass also find cover in depth. So the deeper the water, the more likely those fish are going to be, eating. So, I always tell people start on the banks. The other thing that's really, I think, important, and even if it's not a good fishing day, is fish the river or float the river when it's low and clear, because then you can really see where a lot of those holes are. And then just know that when the water comes up in depth, those holes are still there. They might be a little bit bigger as we get more volume, but there's always going to be that spot no matter what the flow is. So learning the depth game is important. And then it's just time. I mean, I'm 37 and I've been floating these rivers for almost 15 years and I'm still finding new spots in floats that I've done hundreds of times. And so you're never truly done learning, which is part of what's fun about it.
Yeah, and are those streams? I guess I've been thinking about the Juniata. Is that one that changes a lot over the winter with high flows and things like that?
Not really, which is kind of nice about it. There's the only thing that really changes, typically trees falling in the water, right? Or log jams being blown out. That, for instance, there was a spot that was kind of a guarantee every time you went there. There was a nice log jam below this spot. So you kind of had this reverse current, and those fish would sit like right on the transition of that reverse current. And then that log jam got blown out last winter, and it actually created this like half-mile like edge where there's all this wood and lower current flow, but like still this like nice little trough in there because like the water all of a sudden like all that silt got pushed out. And so in some ways it actually made it better, and instead of having one hole, now you have a half a mile of fishable water. And so it does change a little bit, but typically the big pools, the mid-river stuff, eddies that are built are made from, natural rock formation and stuff, like that stuff doesn't change very often. But, just like anything, you will get, certain spots, the silt will start to fill in and you'll lose depth. So there are minute changes that take place, but I haven't gotten to a section of river in the spring and been like, whoa, this is like completely changed. So.
And it sounds like, with your dry lines and the long fluoro, I mean, are you using any sink tips at all, or is that pretty much is it all dry now?
I do fish the most that I will fish is an intermediate line, and that's typically fall and spring, unless we have, a high summer. But most of the time I'm fishing those intermediate lines with a fly that I have to, swim back or, manipulate a lot faster. And so it seems like spring and fall seem to be when I use that the most. But typically I like to only use an intermediate line to kind of break the surface tension, get it down a little bit. And then if I need to get deeper, I just change flies. And so a lot of times I'll tie, let's use the Circus peanut as an example. I might have a dozen Circus peanuts or 2 dozen Circus peanuts in different varying colors, but I might have 3 different weights on them, where I might have 2 tungsten beads or a medium eye or a small eye. And so depending on the depth that I need to fish, I can change that fly and get heavier or lighter. And so you don't have that. I found with sinking lines, especially fast sinking lines, you have a very aggressive, kind of J taper to them and a lot of slack. And so those fish need to hold on to those flies a lot longer for you to feel them, because they have to pull, you have to separate yourself and they have to separate themselves from you to pull up all that slack, where an intermediate line is going to give you a really good, kind of taper down. The one thing that I will say is that like Scientific Angler makes some amazing triple density lines now. So you can kind of manage that angle and that connection, by having a fly line that has 3 different sink rates to it. And so I really like, if I do ever go deeper, and SA has what they call a hover, which is like a 1/2 inch, to an intermediate, which is 1.5 inches, to a type 3, or it's a type 2. I can't remember. I have it down in the basement, but it's just a little bit deeper, or faster sinking than an intermediate line. But because it's tapered on that different sink rate, you still have that really nice angle between you and your fly. And so I really like that stuff. We do a tiny bit of musky fishing. I do not guide for them, but personally musky fish that triple density line, in the like intermediate type 3, type 5, or intermediate type 5, type 7 is awesome for musky, because it gets that fly down. And typically we're fishing more buoyant flies for musky. So you do need that fast sinking line. But again, if you're casting 50, 60 feet and a muskie eats right on the bank, if you've got, this giant belly of fast sinking fly line, you're not going to stay connected well enough to that fish. And so, changing those fly lines just to give yourself a little bit different, depth, but you still have that pretty aggressive angle, that keeps you connected. So you kind of want that straight line from your fly to the tip of your fly rod. And if you have a fast sinking line, you end up with this kind of J shape or this U shape. And I've always found that you lose a lot more fish that way. And people are like, oh, I missed them. And I'm like, well, you probably actually never had that fish. That fish was spitting as you felt that fish eat. So, fly lines can be a pretty awesome thing to mess around with, but I like to try to keep it simple.
Keep it simple. I like that. And how do you know when you're down? How do you know when you're at the right level with your fly to the fish? How do you know when you're either on the bottom or near it when you're fishing, if you can't see it?
If you can't see it, typically you can feel it. And that's one thing that's super nice about the tungsten beads is, tungsten is a denser material. And so it's a little bit more aggressive as a feeling, where lead is super soft. So like you can't feel lead bouncing on the bottom quite as well as you can with tungsten. And I was actually talking to a buddy of mine that works for Schultz up there in Michigan, and he does a lot of carp fishing. We were talking about these tungsten dumbbell eyes that they have now. And he's like, dude, it's amazing for carp fishing because you get the super small one. He's like, I can feel that thing touch a stick now.
Oh, wow.
And that's one of the nice things about the fluoro leaders as well. You talk about something that's a little bit more rigid, right? So tungsten beads are more dense, so you can feel that vibration a little bit better. And then fluoro doesn't stretch as much as mono. And so you can feel that through that fluoro a little bit better. And if you can't feel it even then, you're looking at, kind of the speed at which your fly line is floating. And again, keeping that little kind of J or that small upstream or up current indicator will show you whether or not, it's slowing up every once in a while and ticking the bottom, or if it's just ripping across the surface, you're not down deep enough. So,
yeah, gotcha. When you're out there, is there a way to find, kind of find some of those bigger fish, or, how does that look when you're out there?
I mean, typically in the summertime when I'm with all my big fish days, I find them. I mean, I see them first. And one thing I've noticed with some of these fish, and I don't know how it is in a lot of other places, but at least where we are, is that when you find a dark fish that's in shallow water, that fish is ready to eat. If you find a lighter fish, that fish is, probably 20-30% going to eat. And I think part of that is because that darker fish, and I could be totally making this up, but this is something I've noticed, is that those darker fish typically, I think, are actually sitting up there and like sucking in that sunlight and raising their metabolism a little bit. And when they raise their metabolism, they're sitting in that sunlight and sucking all that sunlight up. The darker they are, the longer they've been in the sun, which typically means that those fish are going to like eat soon. And that's a theory that I have. But if I can't see them, I'm kind of looking for, kind of softer water on the edges, or, knowing that, there's a lot of sticks over here. Finding water and structure subsurface is huge. I found that a lot of bigger fish really like that sandy, woody area. And so if I can find like sand and wood, or at least know where that stuff is when the water's a little higher, you've got a pretty good chance of finding a fish, in that area. But it's, it's never a guarantee. But that softer, slower water is typically where you're going to find those bigger fish if you can't see them.
If you can't see them. But you try to, as you're floating down, you're always looking for fish, trying to find the big fish or whatever, find fish as you're spotting them.
You can typically see them, in the summertime when the water's clear. You can see, a lot of different size fish, not always big fish, in the clear water. But I wish that I had a poling platform on my drift boat so I could be up higher. But I do spend a lot of time standing and rowing so that I can see a little bit better until your eyes are truly adjusted to like looking and seeing these fish. Like, I mean, I've had thousands of times where I'm like, you see that fish right there? And my client looks at it and they're like, no. And I'm like, it's the only dark spot on this little gravel bottom. Like, oh yeah. But, they're looking in the same spot I am, but smallmouth have black tails. And so sometimes I'm just looking for that black tail or a shadow that's, slightly, because they're not sitting totally on the bottom. So if it's a sunny day, you can see that shadow sometimes from those fish, even if you can't really truly see the fish.
Yeah, I gotcha. Wow. And so when you're on the boat floating down, you see a fish. Are you kind of anchoring up, trying to hit it as you go, or does it vary?
I like to hit them as I go because any noise or surface disturbance can be a problem. And I mean, there's a lot of times where I won't even touch the oars, and sometimes that creates a problem because you've got to go quick. But I try not to make any noise if I can see them. I mean, I'll slow down a little bit if they're far enough away. But again, if you're floating, if you're crayfishing, I might drop if it's a certain situation. But when you're popper fishing or, surface fishing in general, typically you're going to get a better presentation if you can keep the boat moving at the same speed as that topwater bug. So I try not to drop anchor when I'm doing that, and it's going to give us a better chance of getting that fish.
That makes sense. Yep, that's it. And then you mentioned before, well, you talked, I guess, what is a typical length? Is 16 feet a typical leader length, or what would be your typical?
No, that would be an extreme long one. If I'm streamer fishing, I like my leaders to be between 6 and 8 feet. I should say if I'm bait fishing or swim fly fishing, 6 to 8 feet. If I'm cray fishing, 10 to 12 feet. If I'm dry fly fishing, probably about that 10 to 12 foot as well. Just depends on the conditions. I have fished 16-foot leaders for bass before when it's low and clear. So I would say streamers in the sense of swim flies with an intermediate line, I'm running 6 to 8 feet. And if I'm running a floating line with a crayfish or a popper, it's going to be in that 10 to 12 foot range.
Okay. And then when you're casting that, how are you, any tips on the casting? It sounds like maybe you got some weight, a heavy, big fly with a longer leader. Is that a challenge? How do you get somebody who's kind of struggling with the casting a little bit to get it out there? And then you have the accuracy, right? You got to get it within a pipe later, right? Or something like that.
Yeah. So with crayfish stuff, when I'm telling people, I'm like, look, don't worry about how tight your loop is. Don't worry about what it looks like. Just get it out there. And a lot of times I tell people to open their loop up because that crayfish is going to fall if you don't have enough momentum with that fly line. And so you're going to end up with way more snags if you're trying to get a perfect loop. And so I tell people, use your thumb because most people put their thumb on the top of the cork. I say use that thumb as your pointer, right? Wherever that thumb goes is where that fly is going to go. So even if you're casting and you're opening your loop up and you're just kind of like almost chucking and ducking, as long as you put that thumb exactly where you want it to be and you don't waver that casting stroke, it's still going to get there. It might just be a wide open loop and just flop down. So, when it comes to the crayfish game, I tell people to just throw all,
Yeah. Don't let perfection get in the way of progress, right? Or whatever it is.
Yeah. The more perfect you are, the worse it's going to be actually. So.
Yeah. Okay. And on the loop, how do you create the bigger loop like that? What is that? Is that just more of using more of your arm, or how would you do that? Like if somebody's trying to,
You're trying to keep your cast exactly the way, you're bending at your elbow and you're following through with your wrist. But like, Lefty said, like used to say at the very end of your cast, give it a little bit of a wrist flick, like you're, hammering a nail. But what I tell people to do is as you're going forward, as long as you keep it in the same motion, you don't want to separate that, you don't want to bend your elbow and your wrist out of sync. But if you can bend your wrist and your elbow at the same time and kind of follow that as you run, you're going to open that loop up a lot more instead of kind of just moving it at the elbow and doing a quick little wrist flick. So, you're basically just widening your form of your cast a little bit, but still keeping it all in sync.
Gotcha. This is cool. Nice. This is awesome. I think we've really covered a ton of stuff today. Talk about this. I'm interested in the steelhead because we have a lot of steelhead. I'm going to be heading near your neck of the woods. We'll probably be hitting. Well, we're going to hit New York and kind of the Ohio stuff. But talk about that steelhead, catching a steelhead there at Lake Eerie on those trips versus catching a big bass. Which one's harder to do?
Well, that's a good question. I think big bass are harder for sure. If you know how to catch a steelhead. I mean, I've seen a lot of guys. I'll just use some of the Erie trips, as an example. I do fish Ohio and New York as well, and I love swinging flies for steelhead, but when it comes to guiding, a lot of times you're just trying to put fish in the net. So you are bobber fishing a lot, but I've seen so many people in these creeks that are no more than 2 feet deep or 3 feet deep that have 6 feet or 8 feet between their indicator and their fly. And they're like, man, it's a tough day. And I'm like, well, yeah, because you can't feel that. That fish isn't going to hold on to your, fly for 10 seconds while your thing gets close. But I think if you can find steelhead and you can present properly to a steelhead, I think steelhead definitely eat a little bit easier. I personally love steelhead. I mean, when I was guiding in Alaska, I got to, do the swinging and stripping for wild Pacific Northwest steelhead. And I've done most of the Great Lakes stuff, and I've done some Washington stuff as well, and which is super fun. But, Erie's close and it's fun, and those fish are big, and you're running 10'6" weights with 6 and 8 pound tippets. So that creates a problem in its own, or challenge in its own. But, we do a lot of dry dropper fishing in Erie, which is super fun. I mean, that's one of my favorite ways to trout fish. So it's kind of very similar to to trout. And then of course, swinging flies when the conditions are right is wicked awesome. And I think what makes Erie, Ohio, PA, and New York Erie a great swinging system is that there are so many bait fish in the lake and in the creeks and rivers themselves that those steelhead eat minnows just as much as they eat eggs and nymphs. So I think that you can have just as good of a day if you got good conditions swinging flies as you were if you were fishing a bead and a nymph.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's been the cool thing for us because we've been heading up there. Jeff Liskay's kind of been helping lead our adventures. And he taught me a bunch of things I fished for steelhead many years, but those really short tippets, like literally like 16 inches, or leader. I mean, literally these short, super short. And that's the thing, keeping control, just like you said, because if you don't have control on where your fly is, you're not going to be feeling the fish. Right. And so,
exactly.
And that's swinging, and that's the same. So I think it's really been awesome. I think the Great Lakes has a crazy cool, steelhead resource, and we're excited to get back up there this year. Well, let's take it out here, Jake. We're going to do our little fly shop shout out segment, and this is today. This is presented by Smitty's Fly Box, who has a bunch of great fly patterns. Smitty'sFlybox.com. I want to just give a shout out to a fly shop. I always love doing this because we know that's kind of the backbone of part of the industry, fly fishing. Who would be your local shop where you're at? Do you have one or two that are out there?
TCO Fly Shop.
Oh, yeah, TCO. Yep.
Yeah, that's our local shop. I used to manage one of their shops, and, our guide service works directly with them. So they are kind of the heart and soul of this area. And really eastern to central Pennsylvania in general. We have 4 locations. So. Oh,
okay. That's what it is. So they have 4 locations in kind of is that in Pennsylvania or multiple states?
Yeah, all in Pennsylvania. So I got one in State College, one in Boiling Springs, PA, one in Reading, PA, and one in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And and that's the thing. I mean, TCO, obviously they're huge. You definitely hear about them around the country. I think there's lots of great fly shops. And then you guys, so that's cool. So your operation, your guiding operation, maybe talk about that a little bit. If somebody wanted to connect with you and get a trip, do they book through TCO, or how would they do that?
They can book through both, directly through me or TCO. So Relentless Fly Fishing is basically TCO's contract guide service as well as an independent guide service.
Oh, nice.
So, well, we're really not independent. Everything we do runs through TCO. But you can book through any one of the guides and it will still kind of go through us/TCO. We don't manage the State College area. We just do Reading, Bryn Mawr, and Boiling Springs currently. But if you were to call the fly shop, you would end up talking to me or Ashley. He's the manager in Boiling Springs, and he would set you up with one of my guides or contact me directly, and we can work on that as well. So
perfect. Awesome. All right. Well, let's do our quick little rapid fire, and then we'll take it out of here real quick here. You mentioned boats. So what's your boat of choice you use there? I know there's a ton of great drift boats out there.
I have a Clacka HeadHunter 2. That's my favorite. It's the skiff, not the kind of teardrop. I love that boat. I think it maneuvers super well. It drafts very little water, and it's just a very comfortable boat to be in. And then I fish a lot of NRS rafts.
Oh yeah,
in the spring. So
yeah, perfect, awesome. Yeah, those are 2 great companies. Nice. And tell us, we've done a ton of tips today, but give us one little quick, big bass tip. Somebody's on the water, they're out there today, maybe they're struggling to find a fish. What do you tell somebody to maybe get that first fish?
Go low and slow.
Oh, yeah, low and slow.
Keep it easy and keep it direct.
Right. So can you go too slow?
Yes, and that's when you catch a rock.
Right. Okay, so you got to keep it, moving a little bit.
But in the grand scheme of things, no, you can't really go too slow. You can definitely go too fast, but you can't, there is a fine line between too slow. But I'd rather you go too slow and get stuck on the bottom than go too fast and not be around those fish.
Gotcha. And for glasses, polarized glasses, does it matter the type of lens, the color, or anything like that, or is just get an amber, whatever?
I think amber is really important, but I like the mirror stuff. So I have green mirror, and I have that like Silver Sunrise by Costa, their low light one. I think between those 2, you can pretty much be good in any condition that you're looking for. And in all honesty, sometimes even in the brightest days, I like to use the low light ones, because it just seems to make everything a little bit brighter without hurting your eyesight.
Perfect. Yeah, this is great. Yeah, we definitely love Costa. They've got some good stuff going on the, conservation and everything as well. So let's take it out. Let's finish this one with the that you mentioned earlier on, the falling out of the boat. So you want to leave us with that story as we take it out here today?
Sure. So I was probably only my second year working for TCO, and a buddy of mine got married the night before, and I'll leave out all of the major details except for the fact that I was pretty hungover at this point in the day, and I dropped the anchor, didn't realize that it didn't hold, and my boat kind of drifted down from about a foot of water to about 6 feet of water. And so I stepped out of the boat like I was stepping out of, into a foot, and there was no bottom, and I face planted straight out of my boat.
Damn. There were people to watch this happen.
No, well, my two clients were the only two, and they were like, "You didn't notice that we slid?" And I'm like, "Nope, but I definitely realized where we are now."
Nice. So you went for a dip. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it was funny. I mean, they were great guys. They fished with me pretty much for about 10 years, and then they stopped fishing once COVID hit because they were getting older. But they loved fishing with me, so I didn't ruin the experience by any means.
Good. Well, I guess the reminder there is, like you said, to get plenty of rest the night before the big trip, right? Don't party it up all night.
Exactly.
Good. All right. Well, anything else, Jake, before we get out of here you want to just leave people with as we're thinking about smallmouth bass, steelhead, whatever you have going?
Not really. Otherwise, other than just, if you need to get in touch with me, best is email relentlessflyfishing@gmail.com, or website is www.relentlessflyfishing.com. That's pretty much the two easiest ways to get in touch with me.
Amazing, Jake. All right, we'll send everybody out there and put links in the show notes. And thanks for all the time today. You definitely have a massive amount of information here, so I'm sure people will be connecting with you as we move forward. So thanks again for all your time today.
You got it, man.
That is a wrap. You can grab all of the show notes at wetflyswing.com. And please follow us on Instagram and share this episode out with someone you love. Please send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com, if you have any feedback or want us to put together an episode on this podcast for you. Check in anytime. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and would love to meet up with you on the water. We have new fly fishing schools going all year long and all around the country, so if you want to connect, let's do it right now. All right, time to get out of here. I hope you have a great evening. I hope you have a great morning or great afternoon wherever in the world you are, and I appreciate you for stopping by and checking out the show today. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.